They thought alien cubs could intimidate her. Then she roared. The station smelled like metal and recycled air and something sharp that no human nose could fully name. Mara stepped off the transport shuttle with one bag over her shoulder and a cold coffee cup in her hand. She drank the last of it anyway and crushed the cup and dropped it in the nearest waste unit without breaking her stride. Station Keth 9 was enormous, big enough to swallow 3 Earth cargo ships whole, and it was loud with the sounds of dozens of alien species all moving and shouting and working at the same time. Mara looked around slowly. She was not the kind of person who rushed her first look at a new place. She had brown skin and short-cut hair and dark eyes that had already seen enough hard things in her life to make her very difficult to surprise. She was not tall, not even close, but the way she stood and the way she moved made people look twice at her without knowing exactly why. A thin alien with 4 arms and pale blue-gray skin came walking toward her fast. His name was Drell, and he was the assistant coordinator of the juvenile rehabilitation wing on the station. "You are Mara Hayes?" Drell asked, his 4 hands folding and unfolding in what looked like a nervous habit. "That's me," Mara said. Drell looked her over once, top to bottom, quick, and something behind his large, dark eyes shifted slightly, like he was trying to decide something about her. "We expected someone larger," he said carefully. Mara smiled. Not a warm smile, just a small one. People usually do. Drell said nothing more and turned and led her through the station. The halls of Keth 9 were wide and busy and filled with species of all shapes and sizes. Mara had worked with xenopopulations before, back when the first contact programs expanded Earth's presence in the outer sectors, so she did not stare at anyone. She just walked and looked and listened and let the place settle into her the way she always did. With every new assignment, Drell walked fast and talked faster. He told her that the juvenile wing held young offenders from 31 different species. Most of them were minor cases, territorial disputes, theft, aggression incidents. But the rear section of the wing was different. The rear section held the Vreth cubs. Mara asked what that meant. Drell stopped walking. He turned to look at her with all the patience of someone about to explain something that he had already explained too many times before. "The Vreth are a predator-class species," he said. "They are large, fast, highly intelligent, and in their juvenile stage they are completely without fear. They operate in packs, they test every authority figure they encounter, and they have a very specific method of breaking handlers." "What method?" Mara asked. "Psychological pressure," Drell said. "They do not hurt handlers, not directly, but they use sound, movement, pack positioning, and sustained aggression to create fear. Once a handler shows fear, the cubs consider them prey. And once they are considered prey, the handler becomes useless in that environment." He paused. "We have lost 6 handlers in that wing in the past 2 years. They did not quit, Mara. They broke. Some of them needed medical support afterward." Mara nodded once and kept walking. Drell hurried to catch up. "You do not seem concerned," he said. "I'm listening," she said. "6 handlers," he repeated. "I heard you," she said. They reached the observation deck above the juvenile wing, a long window looking down into a large common area where dozens of young aliens moved around, ate, argued, played rough games, and generally behaved the way young creatures everywhere behaved when they had too much energy and not enough direction. Mara put her hands on the rail and looked down. The common area was divided. She could see it clearly. The smaller species clustered near the far end by the food stations, and the larger ones owned the middle of the room. And at the very back, in the corner that caught the least light from the overhead panels, a group of 6 figures sat together in a tight circle. They were big, even as juveniles, 4-limbed but wide across the shoulders, with dark, gray, scaled skin and flat, angular heads, and eyes that caught the dim light like mirrors. Even sitting still, they looked like they were deciding something. "Those are the Vreth cubs?" Mara asked. Yes, Drell said quietly, and like he did not want them to hear even from this distance. Which one is the leader? Drell pointed, the largest of the six, sitting at the center of the group, slightly elevated on a raised section of floor like it had claimed that spot specifically. That one is called Jar. He has been here 14 months. He was 6 handlers old when we stopped counting. Mara watched Jar for a long moment. Jar had his back half turned to the room, but one of his mirrored eyes was angled toward the observation window. He already knew someone was up there watching him. Smart, Mara thought. Tell me about his background, she said. Drell pulled up a file on his wrist display and read quietly. Jar had been brought in after a border incident in the Outer Vreth territories. His pack had been destroyed in a colonial conflict. He had no family unit remaining. He had been placed in the juvenile system because he was technically still below adult designation age, but his behavior profile matched an adult threat rating in almost every category. Mara listened to all of it without interrupting. When Drell finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He's not broken. He's angry." Drell blinked, all 4 of his small eyes at once. That is not the assessment most handlers arrive at. Most handlers come in looking at the threat, Mara said. I'm looking at the reason. She picked up her bag from where she had set it by the rail. I'd like to go in tomorrow morning, she said. First shift, before the common area gets crowded. Drell stared at her. You want to go in alone? That's the job, she said. Simply. Drell made a sound that did not translate well through the station's ambient audio, but that clearly meant something between disbelief and dread. That night, Mara was given a small quarters room near the staff section. It was clean and narrow and smelled faintly of the same recycled air as the rest of the station. She sat on the edge of her bunk and looked at nothing in particular. She thought about her younger brother, Leon, who at 13 had been the angriest person she had ever known, who had broken things and pushed people away and snarled at anyone who came close. Until she had sat across from him at their kitchen table one night and refused to move and refused to flinch and just said plainly, I see you, but I'm not going anywhere. Leon ran a community center now on the south side of Chicago. Mara lay back on her bunk and closed her eyes. Tomorrow she would walk into that wing. Tomorrow she would meet Jar. She was not nervous. She had never been the kind of person who confused danger with impossibility, but she was focused the way she always got focused before something that mattered. In the common area far below, 6 pairs of mirrored eyes sat in the dark corner and waited for morning too. They thought alien cubs could intimidate her. Then she roared. Mara walked into the juvenile wing at first light, or what passed for first light on a space station. Yes, which was really just the overhead panels shifting from their dim night cycle setting to their slightly brighter morning cycle setting. The common area was mostly empty at this hour. A few of the smaller species were awake, picking at their morning food portions, watching her with the kind of cautious curiosity that young creatures everywhere had when a new adult walked into their space, sizing her up, deciding how safe she was, deciding how much she mattered. Mara walked to the center of the room and set her bag down on a table and pulled out her datapad and started reading through the wing's daily schedule. She did not look up. She did not look toward the back corner. She just read for about 4 minutes. Nothing happened. Then she heard it. A low sound from the far end of the room, almost below hearing. Like a vibration in the floor more than a sound in the air. And she knew without looking that the Vreth cubs were awake and already watching her. She kept reading one of the smaller alien juveniles, a young Thesky with green-striped fur, crept close enough to her table to whisper, "You should go back to the staff area." "Why?" Mara asked, still reading. "Because they are watching you," the Thesky said. "Let them watch," Mara said. The Thesky made a small sound of distress and moved quickly away. The first real move came about 11 minutes into the shift. Mara heard heavy footsteps crossing the room. Not fast, not rushing, but deliberate and measured. The kind of walk that was designed to be heard. She looked up. 3 of the Vreth cubs were walking toward her. Not Jar. Not yet. Just 3 of the others, spread out in a wide triangle formation across the floor. She recognized the shape immediately. She had seen it in every pack species case she had ever worked with. 1 in front to draw attention, 2 flanking wide to cut off retreat options. Classic pressure move. She watched them come and did not move. They stopped about 2 meters from her table, close enough to be threatening, far enough to be technically non-aggressive, and they stood there and stared at her with those mirrored eyes and made the low vibration sound again, louder now, steady and rhythmic. Above in the observation room, Drell watched through the glass with 3 of the senior staff members beside him. "She is not moving," said one of the staff. But a large gray-skinned Oresi named Vec. "I can see that," Drell said tightly. "She should call for backup," Vec said. "She hasn't called for anything," Drell said. Down in the common area, Mara looked at the 3 cubs for a moment. Just looked calmly, the way she looked at everything. And then she looked back down at her datapad and kept reading. The 3 cubs exchanged a look between themselves. They had expected something. A flinch, a step back, a call to the door, the particular stiffening of posture that prey species showed when they recognized they were surrounded, but there was none of that. The lead cub made a different sound, sharper. "Ein signal," and moved closer. Mara still did not look up. The cub reached out one large clawed hand and knocked her datapad off the table. It clattered loudly on the floor. Mara looked at the datapad on the floor. She looked at the cub. She reached down, picked up the datapad, checked it for damage, found none, set it back on the table, and went back to reading in the observation room. Imvek made a small sound of disbelief. This pattern continued through the rest of the morning. The cubs destroyed her stylus. She took out a spare from her bag. They overturned her chair. She righted it and sat back down. They circled her table in tight, slow loops, making noise. She rotated her chair slightly to keep them in peripheral vision and kept working. Every standard intimidation technique in the Vreth juvenile playbook landed on Mara like rain landing on rock. It hit and ran off and left nothing behind. By midday, the 3 cubs had retreated back toward the corner, confused and agitated, and Jar had still not moved. He sat in his spot in the back and watched every second of it with those flat, mirrored eyes, and Mara knew, without needing to be told, how that he was the most dangerous one, not because he was the biggest, but because he was the one doing the thinking. That afternoon, Jar made his move. He did not send the others first this time. He came himself, alone, and he came slow and straight like a line drawn across the floor. The other cubs went completely quiet, and the small species scattered to the edges of the room without being told, because every creature in that space understood instinctively that something significant was about to happen. Jar stopped directly in front of Mara. He was a full head taller than her, even as a juvenile. In 2 years, he would be enormous, and he stood close, well inside the personal space boundary that most species recognized by instinct. And then he looked down at her with pure, controlled challenge. Mara looked up at him. She did not lean back. She did not tense. She met his eyes the way she had learned to meet every hard thing in her life, straight on, without blinking. Without giving the moment more power than it deserved, Jar held her gaze for a long count. Then he did it. He opened his chest cavity. Vreth cubs had a secondary ribcage expansion capability that made them look nearly half again as wide and tall as they actually were. And he released the subsonic roar. It was not just sound. It was pressure and vibration and something primal that hit the nervous system directly without asking permission first. It was the kind of sound that evolution had spent millions of years teaching every living thing to run from. Every small species in the room flinched hard. Two of them hit the floor. In the observation room above, two of the senior staff stepped back involuntarily from the glass. Mara blinked once, then she yawned. Not a performed yawn, not an exaggerated one meant to mock him, just a slow, incomplete, entirely genuine yawn, the kind that came from someone whose body had decided this was a fine moment to say it was tired. The sound stopped. Jar stared at her. He had never once in his life produced the subsonic roar and had the target yawn at him. His head tilted, just slightly, the first real sign of confusion she had seen from him since arriving. Mara looked back at her datapad. In the back of her mind, she made a quiet note. The subsonic roar had not hit her the way it hit everyone else, and she had a theory about why. She had spent too many years in too many loud and threatening places for her nervous system to have a clean fear response anymore. It had been recalibrated somewhere along the way without her even noticing whatever the reason. The result was the same Jar's best weapon had fired and missed. And now Mara could see something new moving behind those flat-mirrored eyes. Not anger, calculation. He was not done. She knew that with total certainty. But the game between them had shifted into something new, and behind him the other 5 cubs had moved without her noticing, spreading out slow and quiet, cutting off the path to the exit. In a loose circle around her, Mara looked at the blocked door. She looked at Jar. For the first time since arriving on Station Keth 9, she set her datapad down on the table. They thought alien cubs could intimidate her. Then she roared. The door was blocked, not physically sealed, just covered, the way a hunting pack covers an exit. With bodies and presence, and the quiet promise that moving toward it would be a very bad decision. 6 Vreth cubs stood between Mara and the only way out of the room. In the observation deck above, Drell was already moving toward the emergency breach controls, a panel on the wall that would send 3 armored security units through the side door in under 30 seconds. "We go in now," Drell said. Vec grabbed his arm, not hard, but firm. "Wait," Vec said quietly. "She is cornered," Drell said. "Wait," Vec said again. "I'm not moving." Down in the common area, every other juvenile in the wing had pressed against the far wall. Some of them had climbed onto the high shelving units to get clear of whatever was about to happen. The room had the particular electric stillness of a moment just before something very big breaks open. Jar stood 3 steps from Mara. He was watching her the way a serious creature watches something it does not yet fully understand. Patient, focused, taking in every small detail, deciding Mara stood still. She breathed in once, slow and deep, and let it out. Her hands were loose at her sides. She was not calculating an escape. There was no escape to calculate, and she was not planning to fight her way through 6 Predator-class juveniles in close quarters because that was not a plan. That was just a fast way to get seriously hurt. What she was doing was simpler than either of those things. She was deciding who she was in this moment, and she already knew the answer. Mara rolled her shoulders back. She planted her feet wider on the floor. Not a fighting stance, just a standing stance, the kind that said clearly and without apology that she was not going anywhere. And she lifted her chin and looked directly at Jar. And then she opened her mouth. What came out was not words. It was a sound that started somewhere deep in her chest, lower than most people would expect from someone her size, and it built fast. Now rising up through her ribs and her throat and out into the room like something that had been waiting a long time to finally get free. It was a roar, not the biologically engineered subsonic weapon that Jar used. Not a species-specific intimidation tool with millions of years of targeted evolution behind it. Just a raw human sound, the kind that had come from the plains and the forests and the cold mountains of Earth for 100,000 years before humanity ever looked up at the stars and decided to go there. The sound of a creature that had been pushed far enough and had decided, simply and completely, that it was done being pushed. It filled the room entirely. It was not the loudest sound the Vreth cubs had ever heard, but it was different in a way that their instincts processed before their minds could catch up. It carried something that the subsonic roar did not carry, something that had no clean name in the Vreth language or in most languages anywhere across the known galaxy. The closest any translation could get was this: "I am not afraid to die fighting you." Jar took one step back. He did not decide to take it. His body took it before his mind could weigh in on the matter. And that was significant. That was enormously significant. But because Jar had never taken a backward step from anything in his entire life, the other 5 cubs went absolutely still. The roar ended. Mara stood in the quiet that followed, and her breathing was steady, and her hands were still loose at her sides, and she looked at Jar and held the look without letting it go. Then she spoke. Her voice was calm and even and very direct. She had learned a working level of Vreth dialect from the station files the night before, rough and probably badly accented, but functional enough. And she said to him in his own language, "I am not food. I am not staff. I am not something you can drive away from this place." She paused for exactly one breath. "I am the person who is going to be here every single day until every one of you has grown up enough to walk out of here on your own. And I am the person who is going to make sure you live long enough for that to happen. You can accept that, or you can waste both of our time. But I am not leaving. Not today. Not ever." The room was absolutely silent. Even the small species pressed flat against the far wall seemed to be holding their breath. Jar stared at her. His large flat head was very still, the kind of still that meant serious and deep internal processing. And Mara waited and did not rush him, and did not add anything else. She had said what she had to say. The rest was his to decide. Drell, upstairs at the breach controls, had not triggered the alarm. He stood with his hand near the panel and watched through the glass and could not explain to himself why he had not acted yet. Only that something in the scene below told him clearly to wait. Now that this was not a disaster unfolding, but something else entirely. Something he did not have a name or a category for. Vex stood beside him, watching with all 4 eyes wide and his mouth slightly open. In the common area below, Jar turned his head slowly to look at the 5 cubs behind him. A look passed between all 6 of them. Something communicated without a single word, the way pack species always communicated the things that mattered most. And then Jar turned back to face Mara. And he did something that none of the previous 6 handlers had ever once seen him do. He lowered his head, not all the way down, not submissive, but down to the level where his mirrored eyes were no longer above hers, but level with them. And he held it there and did not move. In Vreth culture, this gesture had one specific meaning. It meant, "I hear you, you exist. I will not pretend otherwise." It was not friendship, it was not trust, it was not surrender, but it was acknowledgement. And acknowledgement from Jar was something that nobody on Station Keth 9 had ever received before, from any handler, on any day, for any reason. Mara looked at him steadily. She gave him one small nod in return. The cubs behind him began to move, not toward her, but away. Spreading out and drifting back toward their corner in the loose, unhurried way of creatures that have decided a threat is no longer immediate. The room breathed again. The small species on the shelves climbed carefully down. Mara picked up her datapad from the table. She looked at the daily schedule on the screen and said quietly to Jar, without looking up from it, "Meal period is in 40 minutes. After that, I have individual assessment sessions. You are first on the list." Jar said nothing, but he did not walk away either. He stood near the table, not looming, not posturing, just standing. in the particular way of a creature that is not sure what comes next, but has decided that wherever this new thing is going, it wants to be there to see it above in the observation room. Drell finally stepped back from the breach panel. He looked at Vec. Vec looked back at him. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. Then Vec said very quietly, "I have worked with juvenile populations for 19 years across 6 different stations." He paused. "I have never seen anything like that in my life." Drell looked back through the glass at Mara, standing calm and small in the center of the room with Jar beside her and 30 other alien juveniles watching carefully from the walls. "What did she do?" Drell asked. Vec thought about it for a long moment. "I think," he said slowly, "she just refused to be small. They thought alien cubs could intimidate her." Then she roared. The story moved through Station Keth 9 the way all true stories move through closed spaces. Fast. And growing with each telling by the second day after the incident in the common area, every staff member on the station had heard some version of it. The new human handler walked into the Vreth wing alone, got cornered by all 6 cubs at once, and instead of calling for help or running or breaking down the way every handler before her had broken, she roared back at them, and then calmly went back to her work. Some versions had her producing a weapon. Some versions had her fighting Jar directly with her bare hands. None of the versions were fully accurate, but all of them shared the same true center. She had not been afraid. And somehow that single fact had changed everything. Mara was not interested in the story, she was interested in the work. Every morning she came into the juvenile wing at first shift and sat up at her table in the center of the room and began the day the same way, quietly, simply, without drama and without ceremony. She established a structure for the Vreth cubs that had not existed before her arrival: wake cycle, meal period, individual assessment time, group activity, second meal, low stimulus rest period, second group activity, end of shift. Simple and repeating and the same every single day. The cubs tested the structure in the first week, showing up late, refusing activities, disrupting other juveniles during group sessions, and Mara responded to every single violation with the same thing: consequence, calmly delivered, without anger, without negotiation, without changing her face. If Jar refused to come to the table for individual assessment, his second meal period was delayed by 30 minutes. Not taken away, just delayed. Because she was not in the business of punishing hunger, she was in the business of teaching cause and effect. If the other cubs disrupted a group activity, the activity ended immediately for everyone, and the whole group sat in silence until the next scheduled period began. No shouting, no threats, no pleading. Just the clean and simple logic of actions have results, and you are the one who chooses your actions. The cubs hated it, and then, slowly, so slowly that even Mara almost missed the shift. They began to adapt to it. Jar was the last one to adapt and the most interesting to watch doing it. He came to individual assessment on the 5th day, late, and with his broad shoulders set high in the Vreth posture that meant he was prepared to be difficult. And he sat across from Mara and looked at her with the particular look of someone waiting to be told to do something they can refuse. Mara opened her assessment file and looked at it for a moment, and then looked at him and said, "What do you want to do when you leave this place?" Jar blinked. That was clearly not what he had expected. "I want to know." Mara said simply, "What does Jar want when all of this is over?" There was a long pause. Then Jar said, in his rough Vreth speech, "The question is foolish, and there is no when all of this is over, there is only this." "Why?" Mara asked. "Because I am Vreth," he said, like those 3 words were the only answer anything could ever need. "You are a Vreth juvenile in a rehabilitation facility," Mara said. "That is where you are. That is not what you are." He stared at her. "What I am he said, flat and careful, is the last of my pack. The room was quiet for a moment. Mara did not fill the quiet with anything. She let him have it. After a while, he said, low and controlled, "We were 8. When the colonial ships came through, we were 8. Now I am here and the others are not here. That is what I am." Mara nodded once. "I know," she said. "I read your file." "Then you know there is nothing after this for me." "I know that is what you believe right now," Mara said. I believed something very similar once." Jar tilted his head in that way he had. The slight, careful tilt that meant he was paying real attention, and Mara told him, briefly and plainly, about her own years. Parents gone when she was 16, 3 younger siblings to feed and manage and keep safe and keep out of the kind of trouble that the neighborhood around them seemed designed to produce. The long, grinding years of building something out of nothing at all with her own 2 hands and her own refusal to stop. She did not tell it like a sad story. She told it like a true one. Jar listened to all of it without moving. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You are very small to have carried all of that." Mara smiled. The real kind this time, but not the small, polite one. "Everyone says that?" Outside the assessment room, 3 of the other Vreth cubs were sitting near the door with their backs against the wall. They were pretending not to listen. They were absolutely listening. In the weeks that followed, Mara's approach began to produce results that were visible to anyone paying close attention. Not dramatic ones, not the kind that made for impressive formal reports, but the quiet, real kind that people who had worked with juveniles long enough knew exactly how to recognize. The pack aggression toward the smaller species in the common area dropped significantly. The volume levels during group activity dropped. The cubs began showing up to structured periods on time. Not all of them, not every day, but often enough to matter, and often enough to measure. Jar began using individual assessment time to actually talk, slowly and carefully, feeling his way through each word, about what he remembered of his pack, and what he thought a life after the facility might look like if he allowed himself to think about it at all. One afternoon, a visiting alien diplomat named Counselor Sarath arrived at the station for an unrelated inspection tour. A tall, silver-skinned figure from the Meridian Assembly who was moving through several facilities in the sector and was taken through the observation room above the juvenile wing as part of the standard walkthrough. Sarath stopped at the glass and looked down for a long time without speaking. Below, Mara was running a group coordination activity, the Vreth cubs and 4 other juvenile species working together on a structured physical problem, moving a series of heavy components from one side of the room to the other in a specific sequence that required communication and timing. And the whole group was working, actually working together, without it falling into fighting or collapsing, the way group activities in this wing had always collapsed, before Sarath watched with an expression that Drell, standing beside her, could not immediately read. "This is the wing," Drell said carefully. That previously required emergency breach protocol activation on a weekly basis." "And the human arranged this?" Sarath asked. "She did," Drell said. Sarath was quiet for a moment longer. "What is her method?" Drell thought about all the times he had tried to figure that out and come up empty every single time. "I am not entirely sure," he said honestly. "She refuses to be intimidated. She holds the structure without bending it. She asks them questions that no one else has ever thought to ask." Sarath looked at him. "What kind of questions?" "She asks them what they want," Drell said. "She asks them who they intend to be." Sarath turned back to the window below. Jar was lifting the heaviest component in the sequence, lifting it easily, by the way his species handled heavy things, and placing it precisely where Mara had indicated it needed to go, and then looking back at her with something in his face that was still too new and fragile to be called pride, but was clearly and unmistakably heading in that direction. Sarath watched this for a long time without speaking. The Vreth population in this sector is classified as non-rehabilitable by most institutional standards, Sarath said quietly. Yes, Drell said. This handler appears to disagree with those standards. She does, Drell said. Sarath said nothing more. But that evening, back on her ship in the docking bay, and she sent a message to 3 members of the Meridian Assembly Council, and 2 of those 3 members sat on the committee that determined funding and policy direction for every juvenile facility operating in the sector. That message, which no one on Station Keth 9 knew about yet, set something in motion, something that would arrive on Mara's datapad in the form of a formal hearing notice exactly 4 days later. They thought alien cubs could intimidate her. Then she roared. The notice arrived on Mara's datapad on a Tuesday. It was brief and formal and carried the official seal of the Meridian Assembly Juvenile Oversight Committee, and it informed her that a formal review had been initiated regarding the Vreth population housed in the juvenile wing of Station Keth 9, and that a hearing would be held in 4 days to determine the appropriate placement and future classification of the 6 Vreth juveniles currently under her care. Mara read it twice. Then she set her datapad down and went back to the morning session. She did not tell the cubs. She ran the day the way she always ran it, structured, calm, and the same as every other day. And she watched Jar working through the coordination activity with the others, and she thought carefully about the word placement and what it meant and where it pointed. She knew exactly where it pointed. The Meridian Assembly ran a high-security facility in the outer sector called Veth Station, a place designed to hold adult, dangerous-class detainees. And there had been quiet talk for months about transferring the Vreth cubs there on the grounds that they exceeded the acceptable risk threshold for a standard juvenile facility. Mara had heard the talk. She had not worried about it before because talk was just talk. This was no longer talk. She spent the next 3 evenings preparing. She pulled every behavioral record from the past weeks, attendance logs, incident reports, assessment notes, on the cooperation scores from the group activities, Jar's individual session records, everything. And she organized it into the clearest possible picture of what had actually happened in that wing since the day she arrived. She was not a lawyer, and she was not a diplomat, and she had never been good at sitting in rooms full of formal authority figures who spoke in careful, measured language designed to make decisions sound smaller than they were, but she was the kind of person who had fought for things that mattered before, and she knew exactly how to do it. The hearing was held in the Assembly Conference Room on Level 7, a wide circular space with a long curved table where 7 committee members sat in formal session attire, and a single chair positioned on the opposite side of the room for the presenting party. Mara sat in that chair alone. No one from the station staff had come with her. Drell had offered, and she had told him to stay with the wing, and he had understood and looked at her the way people sometimes looked at her when they were not sure she fully grasped how serious something was and had decided she probably did. The lead committee member was a large Karev male named Overseer Than, gray-scaled, slow-moving, with the particular patient stillness of someone who made a great many decisions and had long since stopped being troubled by most of them. He opened the session by summarizing the situation. The 6 Vreth juveniles, currently classified as high-risk detained persons, had in the committee's assessment exceeded the operational capacity of a standard juvenile facility, and transfer to a more appropriate secure environment was being actively considered for the protection of all station personnel and other detained juveniles. He did not ask for Mara's opinion on this framing. He asked her to present any relevant operational data she wished the committee to consider. Mara stood up. She walked to the center of the room and pulled up her full documentation on the room's display screen, and walked the committee through it, calmly, clearly, fact by fact. Incident rates in the Vreth wing before her arrival versus incident rates now, cooperative behavior scores across every group session, individual assessment progress markers, now the specific behavioral changes that indicated real, meaningful growth rather than surface-level compliance. She spoke for 11 minutes without stopping. The committee listened with the polite, patient attention of people who had already made up their minds before she walked through the door. When she finished, Than thanked her for her data in the tone of someone wrapping something up, and said that while her results were duly noted, the committee remained concerned that the Vreth species in their juvenile stage presented risks that fell entirely outside the standard rehabilitation framework, and that the welfare of the facility as a whole had to be weighed against individual case outcomes in every situation. He paused. "Furthermore," he said, "we want to acknowledge the considerable effort this handler has made. However, we must be frank. Humans, while valued participants in the interspecies community, do not have extensive historical experience managing predator-class juvenile populations. The Vreth species requires a level of institutional expertise that goes beyond—" Mara stood up. She did not raise her hand. She did not ask permission for the floor. She simply stood up, and the room went quiet, because there was something in the way she stood that made people pay attention before they had consciously decided to. "I want to make sure I understand the committee correctly," she said. Her voice was even and quiet and completely clear. "You are considering transferring 6 children to an adult maximum security detention facility." Than frowned slightly. "They are not technically classified as—" "They are children," Mara said. "Jar is the developmental equivalent of a 14-year-old by every biological and psychological metric on record, the youngest of the 6 tests at the equivalent of 11. I want every member of this committee to hold that clearly in their minds before we continue." The room was very still. "They are children who lost everything," Mara said. "They are children who were placed in a facility and handed down to a parade of handlers who all gave up on them. And they behaved exactly the way any child behaves when every adult in their life either fears them or abandons them. They tested everything and they trusted nothing. And now, for the first time, they are showing real measurable change. Real change that is documented and sitting right there on that screen. And this committee wants to respond to that by sending them somewhere from which most of them will not come back." She looked at Than directly. "I have a question for this committee. What kind of civilization decides that its children are not worth the effort? What kind of civilization looks at a 14-year-old who has lost his entire family and says the cost of helping him is simply too high? Because I come from a planet that made that exact mistake with its own children in its own history. And I can tell you precisely how it ends. It does not end well for anyone in the room. And it does not end well for the civilization doing the deciding." The room was completely silent. Than was looking at her with an expression she could not read. 2 other committee members were looking at the surface of the table in front of them. One was looking directly at her with something that was very close to discomfort. Mara took one steady breath. "I am not asking for anything extraordinary," she said. "I am asking for the program to continue. I am asking for 6 children to be given the same chance that every child in every civilization deserves, the chance to grow up. That is all I am asking for." She sat back down. For a long moment, nobody in the room spoke. Then something happened that nobody present had planned for or expected. The side door of the conference room opened, not the main entrance. The side door, the one leading to the outer corridor, the one that should have been secured during a formal committee session. Jar stepped through it. He was enormous in the conference room, too wide for the scale of the furniture, too large for the space between the rows of chairs. And he moved slowly and very deliberately, and stopped just inside the door and stood there behind him. Barely visible in the corridor through the open door, the other 5 cubs waited in silence. Jar looked at the committee. The committee looked at Jar. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then Jar looked at Mara. Just one look. A brief and direct and carrying everything that needed to be said. And then he looked back at the committee and stood completely still. He did not speak. He did not posture. He did not expand his chest or produce the subsonic roar or display in any of the ways his species was known and feared for across the sector. He just stood there, a 14-year-old who had lost everything, standing beside the one adult who had refused to let go of him. The committee understood what they were looking at. Than looked slowly at the other committee members, moving down the row. Then he looked down at his documentation for a long moment. The vote was taken quietly and without ceremony. 5 in favor of continuing the rehabilitation program, 2 abstentions, 0 votes for transfer. Mara looked at Jar. Jar looked back at her. She picked up her bag and stood and walked toward the door, and as she passed him, she said without slowing down, "You are getting extra chores for the next 2 weeks for following me here." Jar made a sound, low in his chest, short. The breath sound that did not translate cleanly into any other language, but that every species in the galaxy somehow understood anyway. It was laughter. They walked back through the station together. The small human woman and the enormous gray-scaled juvenile who had once been the thing that broke handlers, side by side through the wide, busy corridors of Station Keth 9, back toward the wing where 5 more were waiting. And somewhere in the long official recording of a formal committee session that would later be reviewed by 3 different assembly oversight bodies, there was a moment, 11 seconds long, where a human woman stood in the center of a room full of authority and said quietly and without flinching that children were worth the effort. And the galaxy, slowly and imperfectly, began to listen.